Tucked high in Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains, this hollow has been home to generations of mountain families. Here, log cabins still warm with wood smoke, gardens climb the hillsides, and the creek keeps its steady song.
The buried truth behind the issues. People's settlement. The hidden tribe of the Appalachian Mountains. Money has no memory. That is what they told me during the weeks I spent in the vaults beneath the Blue Ridge Mountains, the underground chambers where wealth that should not exist was stored, catalogued, and transformed into something clean and untraceable. Money has no memory, they said, and neither should I if I wanted to survive what I had discovered. I am writing this now because I have decided that memory is more important than survival, because the truth about what I witnessed is too significant to die with me, and because somewhere in those hollows of Amherst County, Virginia, the people who held me captive are still operating, still processing the dirty money of criminals and corrupt officials, still serving as the hidden bankers for anyone who needs wealth to disappear from the eyes of governments and regulators. I am a land surveyor, not a journalist or an investigator, and I never intended to uncover anything more than property boundaries and topographical features. But the work I was hired to do brought me into contact with secrets that have been buried in those mountains for more than 2 centuries, and now I carry those secrets whether I want to or not. My name is Daniel Whitmore. I was a licensed land surveyor based in Richmond, Virginia, with 15 years of experience mapping properties throughout the mid-Atlantic region. My work had taken me into every kind of terrain, from suburban developments to industrial sites to the remote rural areas where property boundaries had not been surveyed since the original land grants were issued centuries ago. I was good at my job, known for precision and thoroughness, and I had built a reputation that brought me contracts from major clients including utility companies, government agencies, and energy corporations that needed accurate mapping before they could proceed with their projects. When I was hired in the spring of 2022 to survey a proposed pipeline route through the mountains of Amherst County, I saw it as a challenging but routine assignment, the kind of work I had done dozens of times before. I did not understand that I was about to map my way into a world that existed parallel to everything I thought I knew about money and power in America. The pipeline project was controversial from the beginning. Environmental groups opposed it, local residents were divided, and the permitting process had been contentious for years before the company finally secured the approvals necessary to proceed. My role was technical rather than political. I was contracted to survey the proposed route, identify property boundaries, document topographical features that would affect construction, and produce the detailed maps that engineers would use to plan the actual pipeline installation. The work would take several months and would require me to traverse some of the most remote terrain in the Virginia mountains, areas where the forest was so dense and the terrain so challenging that accurate surveying had never been attempted with modern equipment. The route passed through an area that locals referred to as the Issues Hollows, a region that had been occupied for centuries by a community whose origins were shrouded in mystery and whose relationship with the surrounding population was marked by suspicion and isolation. The Issues people, I learned through my preliminary research, were one of several mixed-race isolate communities that had existed in the Appalachian region since the colonial era. Their name supposedly derived from their status as issues of forbidden unions between white colonists, African slaves, and Native Americans, people whose mixed heritage made them unacceptable to all 3 communities, and who had retreated into the mountains to build lives apart from the society that rejected them. They had lived in the same hollows for more than 200 years, maintaining their isolation through a combination of geographic remoteness and deliberate avoidance of contact with outsiders. I encountered resistance from the Issues community almost immediately after beginning my survey work in their territory. Property owners refused to grant access to their land. Gates that should have been unlocked were padlocked. Roads that appeared on maps turned out to be blocked by fallen trees that looked suspiciously deliberate. Community members I encountered in the field were uniformly hostile, telling me that my work was not welcome and that I should find an alternative route for the pipeline that did not pass through their hollows. I reported these obstacles to my clients, who responded by engaging local attorneys to enforce the easement rights that the company had acquired through the permitting process. The legal pressure eventually produced grudging cooperation, with property owners allowing access under threat of court action, but the hostility never diminished. I conducted my survey under the constant surveillance of community members who watched my every move, and who made clear through their presence that I was not welcome in their territory. The discovery that changed everything came in late June, approximately 2 months into my survey work. I was mapping a section of terrain along a ridge that would require significant excavation for the pipeline installation, using ground-penetrating radar to identify subsurface features that might affect construction. The radar returns showed something unexpected. A void beneath the surface that was too regular, too geometric to be natural. The shape suggested a chamber of some kind, a space carved into the rock that extended for what appeared to be several hundred feet in multiple directions. I assumed initially that I had discovered an old mine shaft or perhaps a natural cave system that had not been previously documented. I marked the location for further investigation and continued my survey, not understanding that I had just identified the entrance to a secret that the issues community had been protecting for generations. The community's response to my discovery was swift and alarming. Within hours of my radar survey, I was approached by a group of men who identified themselves as community leaders and who demanded to know exactly what I had found. I showed them my survey data, explaining the subsurface void in technical terms, suggesting that it might be a historical mining operation that would need to be documented before construction could proceed. Their reaction told me immediately that I had stumbled onto something far more significant than an abandoned mine. They conferred among themselves in voices too low for me to hear, and then their leader, a man who introduced himself as Elder Thomas Branham, informed me that my survey work was suspended pending consultation with community attorneys. I was escorted off the property and told not to return until I received explicit authorization. I reported the incident to my clients, who were frustrated by yet another delay, but who agreed to pause the survey while legal issues were resolved. What I did not tell them was that I had become intensely curious about what I had discovered, that the community's extreme reaction to a simple radar anomaly suggested something far more significant than mining history. I began researching the issues community more thoroughly, digging through historical records, court documents, and the fragmentary academic literature that had attempted to explain their origins and their persistent isolation. What I found was intriguing but inconclusive. References to the community's reputation for secrecy, suggestions that they had served various functions for the surrounding society over the centuries, hints that their isolation was not just defensive, but somehow profitable. Nothing I found explained the underground chamber I had detected, or the community's intense reaction to its potential exposure. I made the decision that would nearly cost me my life 3 weeks after my survey was suspended. I returned to the area at night, without authorization, carrying portable radar equipment that would allow me to conduct a more detailed scan of the subsurface void. I told myself that I was simply gathering information that would help resolve the legal dispute, that understanding what was beneath the ground would help everyone move forward with the pipeline project. In reality, I was driven by curiosity that had become something closer to obsession, a need to understand what could be so important that an entire community would mobilize to protect it. I parked my vehicle several miles from the site and hiked in through terrain I had mapped thoroughly during my authorized work, confident that I could reach the location, conduct my scan, and depart before anyone knew I had been there. They were waiting for me when I arrived. I never determined how they knew I was coming, whether they had surveillance systems I had not detected, or informants who had reported my preparations, or simply an understanding of human nature that predicted I would not be able to leave the mystery alone. What I know is that I walked into an ambush executed with military precision, that I was subdued before I could react or flee, and that I found myself bound and hooded and transported through darkness to a destination I could not see. When the hood was finally removed, I was underground, in a chamber carved from solid rock, surrounded by people whose expressions made clear that my survival was not guaranteed. The man who interrogated me was Elder Thomas Branham, the same community leader who had suspended my survey weeks earlier. He was calm in a way that suggested complete confidence in his control of the situation, asking questions about my discovery, my research, my communications with clients and colleagues, my understanding of what I had found. I told him the truth, because I had nothing to gain from lying, and because I hoped that cooperation might improve my chances of survival. I explained that I had detected a subsurface void, that I had assumed it was a mine or cave, that my return visit was driven by professional curiosity rather than any intention to expose or exploit what the community was protecting. He listened without visible reaction, asked follow-up questions that probed for inconsistencies, and eventually seemed satisfied that I was telling the truth about my limited understanding of what I had discovered. Then he decided to educate me. What followed was an explanation that transformed my understanding of wealth, power, and the hidden systems that operate beneath the surface of American society. The issues people, Branham told me, had been serving as underground bankers for more than 2 centuries, providing services that the official financial system could not or would not provide. The chambers I had detected were vaults, storage facilities for physical wealth, that clients wanted to keep beyond the reach of governments, creditors, divorcing spouses, and anyone else who might have claims on their assets. The operation had begun before the American Revolution, when wealthy colonists needed places to hide assets from British taxation, and it had evolved continuously through every subsequent era, adapting to new circumstances while maintaining the core competency that made the community valuable. The ability to make wealth disappear completely and to make it reappear when and where the owners desired. The history Branham described was remarkable in its scope. During the antebellum period, the issues had served wealthy Southern planters who wanted to protect assets from the uncertainties of an economy built on slavery. When the Civil War came and Confederate defeat became increasingly likely, the vaults in the Blue Ridge had received enormous quantities of gold, silver, and valuables that plantation owners wanted to hide from Union confiscation. Much of this wealth had never been retrieved, either because the original owners had died during the war, or because their heirs did not know about the deposits, or because subsequent generations had been unable to establish their claims to assets hidden by ancestors whose records had been lost. The unclaimed deposits had become the foundation of the community's own wealth, a capital base that had allowed them to expand their operations and to invest in the infrastructure necessary to serve increasingly sophisticated clients. During Prohibition, the vaults had served bootleggers who needed to hide the enormous profits generated by illegal alcohol. The issues had developed capabilities for converting cash into gold and other physical assets that could be stored indefinitely without losing value, providing a service that the criminal entrepreneurs of the era desperately needed. The same capabilities had served organized crime throughout the 20th century, processing the proceeds of gambling, narcotics, and every other illicit enterprise that generated cash that could not be deposited in legitimate banks. The vaults had grown larger and more numerous, carved deeper into the mountains, equipped with security systems that rivaled anything designed to protect government facilities. More recently, Branham explained, the operation had evolved to serve a globalized clientele. Drug cartels from Mexico and Colombia used the issues vaults to store wealth that they could not safely keep in their own countries. Corrupt politicians and businessmen from around the world deposited assets that they wanted to hide from investigators and prosecutors. Tax evaders transferred wealth that they wanted to keep beyond the reach of the IRS and foreign tax authorities. Criminals of every description used the services, paying substantial fees for the security and anonymity that the issues provided. The operation processed billions of dollars annually, Branham estimated, though exact figures were difficult to calculate because the transactions were designed to leave no records. The technology involved had evolved dramatically over the generations. The original vaults had been simple chambers carved into the rock, secured by nothing more than their concealment and the community's willingness to protect them. Modern vaults incorporated sophisticated security systems, including biometric access controls, environmental monitoring, and countermeasures designed to defeat any attempt at unauthorized entry. The community had invested heavily in technology that would protect their clients' assets, understanding that their reputation for security was their most valuable asset. A single breach, a single theft, a single exposure would destroy the trust that had been built over 2 centuries of reliable service. The conversion capabilities were equally sophisticated. The issues could accept wealth in virtually any form and convert it into whatever form the client desired. Cash could be transformed into gold, precious gems, cryptocurrency, or any other store of value that could be concealed and transported. Real estate and business interests could be acquired through shell companies that concealed the true owners. Art and collectibles could be purchased and stored in conditions that would preserve them indefinitely. The community had developed expertise in every mechanism for storing and transferring wealth, and they employed specialists who understood the legal and financial systems of countries around the world. I asked Branham why he was telling me all of this, why he would reveal secrets that the community had protected for centuries to a surveyor who had stumbled onto their operation by accident. His answer chilled me more than anything else he had said. He was telling me, he explained, because I needed to understand what I was dealing with in order to make an informed decision about my future. I had discovered something that could not be undiscovered, learned something that could not be unlearned. The community now needed to decide how to manage the threat I represented, and my understanding of that threat would determine whether management meant incorporation into the operation or elimination from it. He left me alone after that, confined in a small room carved from the rock, to contemplate the choice that would determine whether I lived or died. I spent 3 weeks in that underground facility, held in conditions that were physically comfortable but psychologically devastating. I was fed well, given books and other materials to occupy my time, and treated with a courtesy that seemed incongruous given my status as a prisoner. But I was also confined in a space from which escape was impossible, surrounded by rock that absorbed sound and eliminated any sense of day or night, forced to contemplate my situation without any distraction from the reality of my powerlessness. The community was evaluating me, I understood, assessing whether I could be trusted to keep their secrets or whether I represented a threat that needed to be permanently eliminated. My behavior during this period, my attitude toward my captors, my apparent acceptance of their authority, would determine which verdict they reached. During my confinement, I was given tours of the vault facilities, shown the scope of what the community had built over the centuries. The underground complex was vast, extending for miles through the mountains, connected by tunnels that had been excavated over generations. Individual vaults ranged from small chambers that might hold a single client's assets to enormous spaces that contained wealth belonging to major criminal organizations. The security was remarkable. Multiple authentication points, surveillance systems that monitored every movement, countermeasures that could seal sections of the complex in the event of any unauthorized intrusion. The entire facility was designed to survive any external threat, from law enforcement raids to military attack, protected by the rock of the mountains, and by the community's willingness to defend it with force if necessary. I was introduced to specialists who managed different aspects of the operation. There were accountants who tracked deposits and withdrawals with precision that would satisfy any auditor. There were technicians who maintained the security systems and the environmental controls that preserved sensitive materials. There were negotiators who dealt with clients, establishing terms and managing relationships that sometimes spanned generations. There were security personnel who protected the perimeters and who were trained to respond to any threat with appropriate force. The operation employed dozens of people, perhaps hundreds, all of them bound to the community through blood and through the shared secrets that made betrayal unthinkable. The decision about my fate came at the end of my 3rd week of captivity. Elder Branham visited my cell and informed me that the community had decided I could be released, subject to conditions that he presented with the same matter-of-fact clarity he had used throughout our interactions. I would not reveal what I had learned to anyone, ever, under any circumstances. I would complete my survey work in a manner that avoided the vault locations, providing my clients with data that would route the pipeline around the sensitive areas without revealing why. I would maintain a relationship with the community that would allow them to monitor my compliance with these conditions, accepting their oversight as the price of my continued existence. If I violated any of these conditions, he said, I would be found and I would disappear, and the wealth that flowed through the vaults would continue flowing as though I had never existed. I agreed to the conditions because I had no alternative, and I was released from the underground facility through a route that left me disoriented and unable to determine exactly where I had been held. I completed my survey work as instructed, providing my clients with data that recommended a pipeline route avoiding the issues territory for what I described as geological reasons. The project proceeded along the modified route, and the community's secrets remained protected beneath the mountains. I returned to my normal life in Richmond, resumed my career, and tried to pretend that nothing extraordinary had happened during those weeks when I had disappeared into the Blue Ridge, but I could not forget what I had seen. The knowledge I carried infected everything, making me aware of hidden dimensions in every financial transaction, every news story about money laundering or tax evasion, every reference to wealth that seemed to exist outside the official systems that were supposed to track it. I researched obsessively, looking for evidence that would confirm or contextualize what I had witnessed, and I found enough to convince me that the issues operation was real and was likely just one node in a larger network of underground financial services that operated globally. The money that flowed through those vaults came from everywhere and went everywhere, and the people who controlled it were invisible to the systems that were supposed to regulate them. I began this account 18 months after my release, having decided that the conditions I had accepted were not morally binding and that the truth needed to be documented regardless of the consequences to myself. I am writing it knowing that publication will likely trigger the response that Elder Branham promised, that I may disappear just as so many others have disappeared over the centuries. But I am tired of carrying this secret alone, tired of pretending that my silence is protecting anyone other than criminals and their enablers, tired of living with knowledge that should be shared with the world, even if the world is not prepared to act on it. The issues people are real. The underground vaults are real. The billions of dollars in criminal wealth are real. And somewhere beneath the Blue Ridge Mountains right now, money is being deposited and withdrawn, converted and concealed, protected by a community that has been providing these services since before the United States existed as a nation. If you are reading this and you have the ability to investigate, here is what I ask of you. Do not approach the community directly. They have been protecting their secrets for more than 2 centuries, and they will respond to any direct threat with the efficiency they have demonstrated throughout their history. Instead, follow the money. The clients who use the issues services leave traces in the legitimate financial system. Transactions that do not quite add up, wealth that appears and disappears without explanation. Find those traces and follow them backward to the source. Look for the infrastructure that supports the operation. The vaults require supplies, equipment, and services that must come from somewhere. The community maintains relationships with the outside world that could be identified through careful investigation. The technology they employ leaves signatures that experts might be able to detect. The physical security of the vaults, however sophisticated, is not impenetrable to the resources that governments can bring to bear if they are motivated to act. Most importantly, understand the scale of what you are dealing with. The issues operation is not a small-time money laundering scheme run by rural criminals. It is a major financial institution that has been operating successfully for more than 2 centuries, serving clients that include some of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. Bringing it down would require resources and commitment that go far beyond normal law enforcement capabilities. It would require treating the operation as what it is, a threat to the integrity of the global financial system, a mechanism that enables crime on a massive scale, a secret that has been kept too long and that must finally be exposed. I am not able to lead that effort. I am a surveyor, not an investigator or a prosecutor, and I lack the resources and the protection necessary to pursue what I discovered, but I can document what I witnessed. I can provide this account as a starting point for anyone who wants to pursue the truth. I can break the silence that the issues have maintained for so long and that I was supposed to maintain for the rest of my life. My name is Daniel Whitmore. I spent 3 weeks as a captive of the issues people's underground banking operation. I witnessed a system that processes billions of dollars in criminal wealth. I escaped, but I could not expose what I found through any official channel. The rest is up to you. The hidden tribe is still operating. The vaults are still filling with money that should not exist. The wealth of criminals and corrupt officials is still being protected by people who have perfected the art of concealment over more than 2 centuries. Please do not let them continue forever. Please do something. Please. Before I conclude this account, I want to share additional details that might help an investigator succeed where I could not. During my captivity, I learned specific information about the operation that I have not previously disclosed because I feared immediate retaliation. But I have decided that comprehensive disclosure is necessary for anyone who might pursue this truth, and that the risks of holding back information outweigh the risks of sharing it. The vault complex I was shown extended approximately 4 miles through the mountains, with main corridors connecting to individual vault chambers that varied in size from closets to spaces that could hold a commercial aircraft. The main entrance I was brought through was concealed behind a structure that appeared to be an old barn, with the actual vault entrance hidden beneath machinery that looked like agricultural equipment. There were at least 3 other entrances that I was told about, but not shown, providing redundancy in case any single access point was compromised. The ventilation system drew air through shafts that emerged in locations scattered across the mountain, making it impossible to identify the facility's location from surface observation alone. The security systems included biometric scanners, pressure sensors, motion detectors, and monitoring systems that tracked all movement within the complex. The community maintained a security force of approximately 20 full-time personnel, trained to military standards and equipped with weapons that would be illegal for civilians to possess. These personnel worked in shifts that provided continuous coverage of all access points and critical areas within the complex. They were prepared to defend the facility against any intrusion, and Elder Branham made clear that they had done so on multiple occasions in the past, though he did not provide details about specific incidents. The client base I learned about included organizations and individuals from across the criminal spectrum. Mexican cartels maintained significant deposits, using the vaults as secure storage for wealth that they could not safely keep in Mexico or in the U.S. banking system. Russian oligarchs had moved assets to the issues vaults to protect them from sanctions and seizure attempts. Corrupt politicians from multiple African and Asian countries stored wealth that they had stolen from their governments and their people. American criminals, ranging from drug traffickers to corporate fraudsters, used the services for amounts ranging from hundreds of thousands to hundreds of millions of dollars. The fee structure was tiered based on the services required. Simple storage of physical assets like gold and cash cost approximately 2% of the value annually, comparable to what legitimate high-security storage facilities might charge. Conversion services, transforming cash into other assets or vice versa, added additional fees that ranged from 5 to 15%, depending on the complexity of the transaction. The most expensive services involved complete asset restructuring, creating new ownership structures that severed any connection between the wealth and its original source, which could cost 20% or more of the total value. The community's own wealth had grown to staggering levels over the centuries, accumulated through fees, unclaimed deposits, and investments made with the capital they controlled. Elder Branham did not provide specific figures, but the infrastructure I observed and the scale of the operation suggested that the community's assets likely exceeded several $billion. This wealth was distributed among community members according to formulas that I was not told, providing comfortable lives for everyone, while also funding the continuous expansion and improvement of the vault facilities. The relationship between the issues community and law enforcement was complex and murky. Branham implied that the community had arrangements with certain officials who provided warnings about investigations and ensured that inquiries were not pursued too aggressively. These arrangements had been developed over generations, he said, and were maintained through a combination of payments and the leverage that comes from knowing where powerful people have hidden their money. Federal law enforcement was more difficult to manage, but the community had developed strategies for avoiding federal attention, including the complete absence of electronic communications about sensitive matters and the use of intermediaries who could be sacrificed if necessary to satisfy investigators without exposing the core operation. I want to describe one specific incident that Branham told me about during my captivity, an incident that demonstrated both the community's capabilities and their willingness to use force to protect their secrets. In 1987, a group of criminals from Miami attempted to rob the vaults, having learned about the operation through connections in the drug trade. They arrived with weapons and vehicles, expecting to overwhelm the community's defenses and escape with enough wealth to retire. The security force responded with overwhelming force, killing all 7 members of the robbery team and disposing of their bodies and vehicles so completely that no trace was ever found. The criminals' associates in Miami never learned what had happened to them, and the incident became a cautionary tale that discouraged any subsequent robbery attempts. The community had demonstrated that they could and would kill to protect their secrets, and that demonstration had provided protection ever since. The international dimensions of the operation were broader than I initially understood. The issues maintained relationships with similar operations in other countries, informal networks of underground banking services that could move wealth across borders without touching the official financial system. A client could deposit cash in Virginia and withdraw equivalent value in Switzerland, Panama, or Singapore, with the transaction handled entirely through these informal networks. The mechanisms for maintaining trust and settling accounts between these operations were not explained to me, but Branham implied that they were sophisticated enough to handle transactions in the hundreds of millions of dollars. I share these details not because I expect any reader to act on them immediately, but because I want to create a record that cannot be easily dismissed. The issue's operation is not a rumor or a conspiracy theory. It is a real criminal enterprise that has been operating for more than 2 centuries, processing wealth that enables some of the worst crimes imaginable. The community that runs it has become wealthy and powerful beyond what their isolated appearance would suggest, and they have protected their secrets through a combination of geographic isolation, community solidarity, corruption of officials, and the occasional application of lethal force. Exposing this operation will not be easy. The people who run it are intelligent, experienced, and completely committed to protecting what they have built. They have survived for more than 2 centuries by adapting to every threat and neutralizing every attempt at exposure. They will survive this account as well, unless someone with sufficient resources and determination decides to pursue the truth I have revealed. But I believe that truth has power even when it cannot immediately produce action. I believe that documenting what I witnessed creates possibilities that did not exist when the secret was completely hidden. I believe that somewhere, someone will read this account and recognize its significance, and that recognition will lead to investigation. An investigation will lead to exposure, and exposure will finally bring down an operation that has operated in the shadows for far too long. That is my hope. That is why I have written this account, despite the risks it creates for me. My name is Daniel Whitmore. I discovered the issues people's underground banking operation. I witnessed a system that serves the financial needs of criminals around the world. I was released on condition of silence, and I have broken that condition because silence is complicity, and I will not be complicit any longer. The vaults are beneath the Blue Ridge Mountains. The money is flowing through them right now. The hidden tribe is counting their fees and protecting their secrets. Someone needs to stop them. Please let that someone be you. Please. There are additional dimensions of the operation that I learned about during my captivity, aspects that I have hesitated to include because they implicate specific individuals and institutions whose involvement I cannot prove beyond what I was told. But I have decided that a complete account is necessary, and that whoever investigates the issues operation will need to understand the full scope of what they are dealing with. The community's relationship with legitimate financial institutions was more extensive than I initially understood. Elder Branham explained that the issues maintained accounts with major banks throughout the United States, accounts that appeared to belong to ordinary businesses, but that actually served as conduits for moving money into and out of the vault system. These accounts were managed by community members who had established careers in legitimate finance, people who had attended business schools, worked at major firms, and built reputations that gave them access to systems they then used to serve the underground operation. The community had invested in this expertise over generations, sending promising young people out into the world to acquire the knowledge and connections that would benefit the operation when they returned. The legal protection surrounding the operation was equally sophisticated. The community retained attorneys in multiple jurisdictions who specialized in financial privacy and who could intervene to block investigations before they developed momentum. These attorneys were not told the full scope of what they were protecting, but they understood that their clients valued privacy highly and would pay substantial fees for effective protection. When investigations threatened to expose vault locations or client relationships, these attorneys would file motions, challenge subpoenas, and create procedural obstacles that gave the community time to adjust their operations and conceal anything that might be discovered. The political relationships were the most disturbing aspect of what I learned. Branham implied, though he did not state directly, that the community had arrangements with elected officials at both state and federal levels who provided protection in exchange for services. These arrangements had developed over generations, he said, as the community learned which politicians could be trusted and which needed to be avoided. The nature of the services exchanged was not specified, but I understood that they included both financial support for campaigns and more direct assistance in the form of hiding assets that politicians did not want associated with their public identities. These relationships created a web of mutual protection that made official investigation extremely difficult. I want to describe my own psychological journey during captivity because I believe it illustrates something important about how the issues maintain control over the people who discover their secrets. When I was first captured, I was terrified, convinced that I would be killed and that my body would never be found. As days passed and I was treated with unexpected courtesy, my fear transformed into something more complicated, a kind of gratitude toward captors who could have treated me far worse, a recognition that the community's concerns about exposure were not unreasonable given the stakes involved, a gradual acceptance of the logic that silence was a fair exchange for my life. By the time I was released, I had almost convinced myself that keeping the community's secrets was the right thing to do, that exposure would cause harm without producing any meaningful benefit, that my silence was a form of wisdom rather than complicity. This psychological shift is part of how the community maintains security. They do not rely solely on threats and surveillance to keep former captives silent. They work to change how captives think about the situation, to make silence feel like a personal choice rather than an imposed constraint. The tours of the facilities, the explanations of the history, the courteous treatment during captivity, all of it is designed to create a relationship that makes betrayal feel like a violation of something more than a coerced agreement. I had to struggle against this conditioning for months after my release before I could see clearly enough to write this account. The community's internal structure was more complex than I initially understood. Not all Issues families were involved directly in the vault operations. Some families had chosen to remain on the periphery, maintaining the agricultural and commercial activities that provided cover for the community while leaving the financial operations to others. These peripheral families knew that the vaults existed and understood that they were the source of the community's prosperity, but they were not involved in day-to-day operations and were not told details that might compromise security if they were ever questioned. This stratification created a hierarchy within the community, with vault families holding more power and more wealth than those who remained on the periphery. The vault families themselves were organized into specialized roles that had been passed down through generations. Some families specialized in client relations, maintaining the relationships with depositors and handling the negotiations that accompanied major transactions. Other families specialized in security, providing the personnel who guarded the facilities and who responded to threats. Still others specialized in the technical aspects of vault maintenance, the engineering and environmental control systems that preserved the contents and prevented detection. Each specialization required training that began in childhood and continued throughout life, creating expertise that could not be quickly replicated by outsiders. The succession planning was meticulous. Each key role had identified successors who were being trained to take over when current holders retired or died. The community thought in generational terms, planning decades ahead, ensuring that the operation would continue regardless of what happened to any individual participant. This long-term thinking was part of what made them so effective and so difficult to defeat. They were not building something for themselves, but for their children and grandchildren, and they were willing to make investments and accept constraints that more short-term thinkers would reject. I was shown records during my captivity, not the full client database, but samples that demonstrated the scope and longevity of the operation. I saw ledger pages from the 19th century, handwritten entries documenting deposits by names I recognized from history books, wealthy planters, and industrialists whose legitimate records had never mentioned the assets they had hidden in the Blue Ridge. I saw more recent records showing deposits by individuals and organizations whose names would be immediately recognizable to anyone following international crime and corruption. The records were maintained in multiple formats, with physical copies stored in the vaults themselves and electronic copies distributed across systems that could not all be compromised simultaneously. The physical infrastructure extended beyond the vaults themselves. The community maintained properties throughout the region that served various functions in the operation. Safe houses where clients could meet with community representatives, staging areas where assets could be prepared for deposit or withdrawal, transportation hubs that facilitated movement of valuables to and from the vaults. These properties were owned through shell companies and trusts that concealed any connection to the issue's community, and they were maintained in ways that attracted no attention from neighbors or authorities. The transportation networks were particularly sophisticated. The community had developed multiple routes for moving physical assets, using a combination of vehicles, personnel, and logistics that minimized the risk of interception. High-value shipments were divided into multiple components that traveled separately, ensuring that no single loss could be catastrophic. The drivers and couriers who handled these shipments were trained in counter-surveillance techniques and were prepared to take evasive action if they detected any threat. The community had been moving valuables through these networks for decades without any known interception. I should describe what finally convinced me to break my silence and write this account. For 18 months after my release, I kept the community's secrets as I had promised, telling myself that my survival depended on compliance and that exposure would accomplish nothing except my own death. I resumed my career, completed projects, tried to live as though nothing had changed. But the knowledge I carried would not let me rest. I found myself thinking constantly about the money flowing through those vaults, the criminals it served, the crimes it enabled. I thought about victims of drug trafficking whose suffering was financed by wealth hidden in the Blue Ridge. I thought about citizens of corrupt countries whose stolen patrimony was being protected by people who had never heard of them and did not care about their plight. I thought about the fundamental injustice of a system that allowed wealth to escape accountability, while ordinary people faced full consequences for far lesser offenses. The breaking point came when I read about a specific case, a corrupt foreign official who had been accused of stealing billions from his country's treasury and who had apparently succeeded in hiding most of that wealth from investigators who had been searching for years. The article mentioned that investigators believed the money had been moved through underground banking networks, but could not determine where it had ultimately been deposited. I knew where it was. I knew exactly where it was, protected by the same people who had held me captive, maintained by the same systems I had been shown, and I knew that my silence was making me complicit in the continued protection of that stolen wealth. That recognition shattered the psychological conditioning that had kept me silent. I understood finally that my compliance was not neutral, that by keeping the community's secrets I was actively participating in their crimes, that every day I remained silent was another day when the vaults continued operating and the criminals they served continued profiting. I could not undo what I had seen, could not return to the ignorance I had enjoyed before my discovery, but I could choose what to do with the knowledge I now possessed. I could choose silence and complicity, or I could choose exposure and whatever consequences that exposure might bring. I chose exposure. I am choosing it again now, with every word I write. The issues. People are not simply a historical curiosity. a mixed-race community that has survived in isolation for 2 centuries. They are active participants in global financial crime, providing services that enable some of the worst actors in the world to protect and deploy their illicit wealth. Their operation is sophisticated, well-protected, and deeply entrenched in systems that make it resistant to ordinary law enforcement approaches. But it is not invulnerable. It depends on secrecy, and I am breaking that secrecy with this account. I do not know what will happen after I publish these words. The community has demonstrated their willingness to eliminate threats, and I have no illusions about my ability to evade them indefinitely if they decide I must be silenced. But I have decided that some truths are worth dying for, and this is one of them. The world needs to know what is hidden in those mountains. The victims of the criminals who use those vaults deserve to have someone speak for them. The system that has operated in darkness for so long needs to be dragged into the light. My name is Daniel Whitmore. I am a land surveyor from Richmond, Virginia. I discovered something I was not supposed to discover, and I am sharing it with the world, because silence would make me complicit in evil. The vaults are real. The money is real. The crimes enabled by that money are real. Please do not let this truth disappear back into the darkness from which I dragged it. Please act on what I have told you. Please.